December 22nd, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. Private Leo Palmer from his foxhole position stared through the morning mist. The frost-covered ground crunched beneath his boots. 4 figures, one officer carrying a briefcase under his arm, emerged from the German lines waving white flags.
For 3 days, approximately 12,000 American soldiers had been completely surrounded by 5 German armored divisions.
They were running desperately low on ammunition, hungry and freezing, and the Germans were about to offer them a way out, the unthinkable response. None of the approaching German officers knew that this moment would trigger one of the most revealing episodes in military history, exposing a profound cultural divide between armies. This difference would define the very essence of what made the American paratrooper unlike every other soldier who had ever fought. The transformation of German perceptions wouldn't begin on this day, but the mathematics of American military culture were being written not in surrender terms, but in a single word. That word would echo through history and expose the unbridgeable gap between airborne reality and Wehrmacht expectations. Hitler's final gamble. The German offensive had exploded on December 16, 1944, when Adolf Hitler launched his final, desperate gamble to capture the Belgian port of Antwerp and split the Allied forces. Nearly 1,000 tanks and more than 200,000 German troops smashed through thinly held American positions in the Ardennes forest. This surprise attack, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Germany's last coordinated offensive on the Western Front. Rolling hills, dense forests, narrow roads, and the notorious Ardennes weather created conditions that neutralized Allied air superiority. Hitler believed he could recreate the lightning success of 1940, when German panzers had raced through these same forests to the English Channel. Among the Wehrmacht commanders was General Heinrich von Lüttwitz, whose 47th Panzer Corps had been specifically tasked with capturing a small Belgian town most Americans had never heard of before this week. Bastogne sat at the convergence of 7 major roads, radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Every tactical maneuver, every reinforcement column, every supply route in the southern Ardennes depended on controlling this crossroads. Von Lüttwitz understood that Bastogne was not merely a town to be captured, but the key to the entire southern thrust of the German offensive, a rival of the Screaming Eagles. American forces defending Bastogne represented an improvised collection of units thrown together by necessity and circumstance. The 101st Airborne Division, veterans of Operation Market Garden and Normandy, had been resting at Mourmelon-le-Grand near Reims, France, when General Dwight Eisenhower committed his only reserve forces to contain the German breakthrough. The order came through on December 17th. Move to Bastogne without delay. The division loaded onto trucks for a 107-mile journey through snow and freezing rain in the middle of the night. They traveled in open trucks without proper winter gear, without adequate ammunition, and without winter clothing. Most paratroopers wore the same jump uniforms they had worn in Normandy 6 months earlier. Accompanying the 101st was Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, a combined force of artillery, infantry, and tanks that General George Patton had reluctantly released from his Third Army. These armored units had been delaying the German advance just long enough for the paratroopers to arrive. The race was measured in hours. At midnight on December 19th, the leading elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment rolled into Bastogne, establishing positions just 4 hours before German forces would have seized the town unopposed. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the 101st at Bastogne because Major General Maxwell Taylor, the division's regular commander, was in Washington when the offensive began. McAuliffe, a 46-year-old artillery officer who had graduated from West Point in November 1918 during wartime acceleration, was respected, but not particularly well known outside the division. His men called him General Mac, or Old Croc, and he had earned their trust through competence rather than charisma. What nobody yet realized was that McAuliffe possessed exactly the temperament needed for what was coming. He possessed a dry wit, was practical, and was unflappable. A combination that would soon become legendary. The Defense Perimeter McAuliffe organized his defense with mathematical precision, the 506th Parachute. Infantry Regiment established blocking positions at Neuville to the northeast, the 502nd. Parachute Infantry Regiment took positions on the northwest shoulder to block the advancing 26th Volksgrenadier Division. 501st defended the eastern approaches, where the Panzer Division was, already engaging American armor. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment scattered across the western and southern perimeters. Headquarters personnel, service troops, and engineers filled gaps in the line. The perimeter formed a rough circle several miles across. Every unit understood they would be surrounded. The question was whether they could hold long enough for relief forces to arrive. By December 20th, German forces had completely encircled Bastogne. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, Panzer Lehr Division, and 2nd Panzer Division pressed against the American positions from all directions. Von Lüttwitz's forces outnumbered the Americans by approximately 5-1. The Germans possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers, artillery, and armor. American forces were critically short of winter clothing, medical supplies, and ammunition. Fog and snow reduced visibility to mere yards, and the weather prevented close air support or aerial resupply. Temperatures plummeted below freezing. By any conventional military assessment, the tactical situation appeared desperate. The Airborne Creed yet. The men of the 101st Airborne Division operated according to principles that defied conventional military wisdom. These were volunteers who had endured the most demanding training in the American military. They had fought for weeks beyond their planned deployment in the hedgerows of France, jumped from aircraft over Normandy in darkness, and held objectives during Operation Market Garden that should have been impossible to defend. The Airborne Creed, which every paratrooper memorized, stated explicitly, "I never surrender, though I be the last. My goal in peace or war is to succeed in any mission of the day, or die if needs be in the try." These were not merely words recited by rote. They represented a cultural identity that separated paratroopers from every other military formation in the world. German attacks intensified. Throughout December 21st and 2nd, artillery bombardments shattered buildings in Bastogne. Tank assaults probed the American perimeter, searching for weak points. Infantry attacks came in waves against positions held by outnumbered paratroopers. The defenders fought with everything available. The 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion used their 18 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers with devastating effect, destroying approximately 40 German tanks in coordinated ambushes throughout the siege. American artillery, expertly positioned by McAuliffe, concentrated fire on advancing German formations with precision that belied the desperate circumstances. The 101st had massed 36 the 155mm howitzers in the center of the perimeter, capable of delivering targeted fire in any direction. This artillery concentration represented one of the few advantages the beleaguered Americans possessed. They could mass fires against German attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, a capability that proved decisive in breaking up coordinated assaults. The Germans discovered that attacking Bastogne was far more difficult than their numerical superiority suggested. The surrender ultimatum at approximately 11:30 on the morning of December 22nd. 4 German soldiers approached the American lines south of Bastogne, near the village of Remonfosse. The group consisted of Lieutenant Helmuth Henker from Panzer Lehr Operations, Major Wagner from the 47th Panzer Corps, and 2 enlisted men selected from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. They carried white flags and a briefcase containing a surrender ultimatum typed on official Wehrmacht stationery. The German delegation was intercepted by an American outpost from F Company, 2nd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The Germans were blindfolded and taken to the company command post, a foxhole position in the woods. The message was read by Major Alvin Jones, the company commander, who immediately telephoned regimental headquarters in Bastogne. The ultimatum presented von Lüttwitz's assessment of the tactical situation and his offer of honorable surrender. The German commander noted that American forces were encircled by strong armored units, that multiple towns beyond Bastogne had fallen to German control, and that there was only one possibility to save the American troops from total annihilation: honorable surrender of the encircled town. The ultimatum granted 2 hours for consideration, beginning with presentation of the note. If rejected, 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions and German artillery stood ready to annihilate American troops in and near Bastogne. McAuliffe's single-word Major Jones drove to division headquarters in the Heinz barracks with the German message immediately after the deadline expired. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, the acting chief of staff, entered McAuliffe's sleeping quarters adjacent to the communications center to deliver the news. McAuliffe had been catching brief rest after 3 days of continuous command decisions. Moore woke him and explained that the Germans had sent a surrender ultimatum. McAuliffe's initial response was a single word: "Nuts!" He then asked what the Germans actually wanted. Moore explained they were demanding surrender of the American forces within 2 hours or face annihilation. McAuliffe laughed. Given the tactical situation as he understood it, the suggestion struck him as absurd. His forces had repulsed every German attack. They had inflicted heavy casualties on enemy formations. Intelligence indicated that Patton's Third Army was driving north to relieve Bastogne. Weather forecasts suggested clearing skies within days, which would bring both aerial resupply and devastating air support against German armor. McAuliffe believed his men were giving the Germans one hell of a beating, and the surrender demand seemed completely disconnected from battlefield reality. Nevertheless, protocol required some form of written response to an official military communication. McAuliffe sat down with his staff to compose a reply. After several minutes of consideration, he admitted he did not know what to say. The situation was genuinely unprecedented in his experience. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, operations officer, reminded McAuliffe of his initial reaction. "You said nuts." The suggestion drew immediate applause from everyone present. The response perfectly captured both McAuliffe's personality and the situation. He was not known for profanity. Captain Vincent Vicari, his personal aide, would later recall that General Mack was the only general who did not use profane language. "Nuts" was simply part of his normal vocabulary, McAuliffe wrote down the response and had it typed on official division letterhead. The message read in its entirety: to the German commander, nuts, the American commander. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, volunteered to deliver the response personally. He found the 2 German officers still standing blindfolded in the woods under guard. Harper handed them the typed message and explained its meaning in plain English. It means, "Go to hell." He added that if the Germans continued to attack, American forces would kill every goddamn German that tried to break into the city. The German officers saluted stiffly, turned, and departed to report McAuliffe's response to their commander. Incompatible rules. The exchange revealed a fundamental disconnect between American and German military culture that extended far beyond tactical considerations. Von Lüttwitz had approached the surrender demand according to traditional European military convention. His forces held overwhelming material and numerical superiority. The Americans were outnumbered, surrounded, and facing certain destruction if they continued fighting. By the established rules of warfare that had governed European conflicts for centuries, offering honorable terms of surrender was both expected and appropriate. Von Lüttwitz anticipated that rational military commanders faced with hopeless odds would recognize the futility of further resistance and surrender to save their men from needless casualties. According to military traditions dating back centuries, this was common sense, not cowardice. What von Lüttwitz failed to comprehend was that American paratroopers operated according to entirely different cultural principles. The 101st Airborne Division had been activated on August 16, 1942, with a promise from their first commander, Major General William Lee. This division has no history, but it has a rendezvous with destiny. The eagle patch on their shoulders symbolized their intended role as shock troops who would fall on enemies like thunderbolts from the sky. From the beginning, the division cultivated an identity separate from conventional infantry formations. The transformation into paratroopers began with jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where volunteers endured training specifically designed to eliminate those who lacked the mental toughness required for airborne operations. The entire selection process separated men who possessed absolute commitment to the mission from those who retained any instinct for self-preservation that might interfere with combat effectiveness. Earning silver jump wings represented entrance into an elite brotherhood defined by mutual dependence and shared hardship. The unofficial motto, non CBU sed patriae, not for self but for country, captured their self-conception as men who had volunteered to sacrifice everything for missions that regular soldiers would not attempt. Paratroopers understood themselves as fundamentally different from conventional soldiers. They jumped from aircraft behind enemy lines expecting to be outnumbered, surrounded, and fighting without support. Being encircled at Bastogne was not a crisis requiring surrender, but simply another Tuesday for men who had parachuted into Normandy in darkness while being shot at from the ground. The German concept of honorable surrender had no equivalent in airborne culture. Paratroopers were trained explicitly that surrender was never an option regardless of circumstances. The Airborne Creed stated this principle without ambiguity. I never surrender though I be the last. This was operational doctrine, not rhetoric. The 101st had already demonstrated this principle in Normandy, where scattered sticks of paratroopers, sometimes only 5 or 6 men, had held positions for days against German counterattacks because surrendering or retreating simply never occurred to them as possibilities. The same culture now operated at Bastogne on a division scale. McAuliffe's nuts response was not defiance for theatrical effect, but straightforward communication of a fundamental cultural reality. American paratroopers do not surrender regardless of tactical circumstances. The relief and the narrative. The weather broke on December 23rd, transforming the tactical situation overnight. Clear skies allowed the Allied air forces to dominate the battlefield. C-47 transport aircraft flew over 200 supply missions to Bastogne, dropping ammunition, food, medical supplies, and winter clothing by parachute. Paratroopers who had been rationing bullets suddenly had adequate ammunition for sustained defense. Fighter bombers attacked German armor and artillery positions with devastating effectiveness. P-47 Thunderbolt strafed German columns on approach roads. The men of the 101st watched American aircraft filling the sky and understood that relief was inevitable. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the Germans launched their most determined assault against the southeastern sector of the American perimeter. The attack achieved initial penetration of American lines before McAuliffe shifted reserves and concentrated artillery fire broke the German assault. The American perimeter held. That evening, McAuliffe composed a Christmas message for his troops that would become as famous as his nuts reply. He acknowledged the difficult circumstances, the fact they were not home for Christmas, and the cold weather. Then he listed what the division had accomplished. They had stopped cold. Everything thrown at them from north, east, south, and west. He concluded that by holding Bastogne, they were making for themselves a truly Merry Christmas and giving their country and loved ones a worthy Christmas present. The message captured perfectly the cultural mindset that separated paratroopers from conventional soldiers. They were warriors accomplishing a mission of strategic importance, not victims requiring rescue. George Patton's Third Army had begun its relief operation on December 22nd. The same day McAuliffe sent his famous reply. Patton had pivoted 3 entire divisions 90 degrees from their planned offensive toward Germany and driven them north through winter conditions that would have stopped most military movements. The 4th Armored Division, known informally as Name Enough, spearheaded the drive to Bastogne. On December 26th, Combat Command Reserve, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, made the final push toward Bastogne. The attack jumped off from Remy-Champagne, approximately 6 miles southwest of the encircled town. The 37th Tank Battalion, with Company C reduced to just 9 operational Sherman tanks, led a column of mechanized infantry and armor straight through the village of Ardennes, the last obstacle before Bastogne, in what participants described as a hell-for-leather charge through heavy German resistance. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess commanded the lead Sherman tank, designated Cobra King with bumper number. C6, the relief column, broke through at approximately 1650 hours on December 26th. First Lieutenant Boggess shook hands with First Lieutenant Duane Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, symbolically ending the siege of Bastogne. The paratroopers' view, the reaction of the 101st Airborne Division to Patton's arrival exposed the profound cultural divide that the nuts reply had previewed. Conventional military analysis described Patton's Third Army as rescuing the besieged paratroopers. Military historians would later credit Patton's aggressive tactics and rapid maneuver with saving the 101st from destruction. The paratroopers themselves rejected this narrative completely and permanently. At McAuliffe's press conference in Paris on January 2, 1945, he spoke for every soldier who had defended Bastogne. He screamed about only one thing, which had to do with casualties. They needed surgeons. He never asked for help. The distinction was crucial. The 101st had never requested relief from encirclement because being surrounded was not a crisis requiring rescue. They were not asking to be saved from the Germans. They were asking for resources to continue accomplishing their assigned mission. They needed medical support for casualties, because the shortage of surgeons affected their ability to continue fighting effectively. The answer lay in the fundamental difference between how conventional soldiers and paratroopers understood combat operations. Regular infantry received orders to seize and hold specific terrain until relieved by follow-on forces. European military tradition, where armies were expensive investments, incorporated surrender as a legitimate option when tactical situations became hopeless. American paratroopers rejected this entire framework. They volunteered for service specifically because they wanted to fight in circumstances where conventional soldiers would not. They trained for missions that assumed being outnumbered and surrounded. The 101st held Bastogne not because they were trapped there, but because holding Bastogne was their assigned mission. The fact that Patton's Third Army established a supply corridor was useful for logistical purposes, but the paratroopers never doubted they could have continued defending the perimeter indefinitely if necessary. This attitude persisted throughout the decades after the war. Reunion gatherings of Bastogne veterans featured the recurring statement that no member of the 101st Airborne Division ever admitted needing rescue by Patton. This reflected a genuine cultural difference in how paratroopers understood military operations. The mission was successful. The fact that they were surrounded during the mission was operationally irrelevant. The price of victory, the casualties, demonstrated the intensity of combat at Bastogne and the price the 101st paid for holding the crossroads. From December 19, 1944, through January 6, 1945, the division suffered. 1 killed, 491 wounded, 516 missing. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division incurred 53 total casualties. The 4th Armored Division lost approximately 1,000 men killed and wounded during the relief operation. These numbers, while significant, were far lower than German losses. The Wehrmacht committed elite Volksgrenadier and Panzer formations to capturing Bastogne and suffered devastating casualties for no strategic gain. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by American forces in World War II, with total American casualties estimated between 75,000 and 89,000, including between 8,600 and 19,000 killed, depending on methodology and date ranges used. The defense of Bastogne represented a turning point where determined resistance by outnumbered forces prevented German breakthrough and bought time for Allied counteroffensive. Operations McAuliffe's reply and the German surrender. Ultimatum exposed differences far deeper than mere tactical situations. Von Lüttwitz operated according to military traditions, where officers considered the welfare of their men when making decisions about the continuation of hopeless fights. Surrender in the face of overwhelming odds was responsible command that preserved soldiers' lives for future battles. American paratroopers operated according to completely different cultural principles derived from frontier traditions. Volunteer military service and deliberate cultivation of warrior identity, the Nuts' reply was. Straightforward communication that American paratroopers and German panzers were playing entirely different games according to incompatible rules. The Germans brought overwhelming force, expecting logical surrender. The Americans brought cultural commitment to never surrendering regardless of circumstances. These positions could not be reconciled through negotiation, only through combat. The fighting continued for weeks after Patton's forces broke the encirclement, with the 101st transitioning from defensive operations to offensive attacks against German positions surrounding the town. The German offensive had been definitively defeated, and Wehrmacht forces were in full retreat. Even then, paratroopers departed Bastogne not as survivors grateful for rescue, but as warriors disappointed their pursuit of retreating Germans was being interrupted. This attitude pervaded every level of the division, from general officers to private soldiers. The cultural principles displayed at Bastogne were not unique to that battle, but represented consistent patterns throughout the 101st Airborne Division's combat history. In Normandy, scattered paratroopers fought in small groups for days because regrouping with parent units never occurred to them as more important than accomplishing assigned missions. During Operation Market Garden in Holland, the 101st held objectives for longer than planned operations specified because they would continue holding, regardless of how long relief required, since the mission was to hold until relieved. At Bastogne, surrounded by 5 German divisions, the response was identical. Accomplish the assigned mission regardless of circumstances. This consistency demonstrated that airborne culture was not situational adaptation to specific tactical problems, but a fundamental identity that governed how paratroopers understood their role. The volunteer nature of service reinforced this culture. Every man wearing jump wings had chosen this path, knowing exactly what it entailed. Nobody was drafted into the airborne. Soldiers who wanted easier service could have remained in conventional infantry units. Choosing to become a paratrooper meant accepting that surrender would never be considered as an option and that you would fight in the worst possible circumstances. This self-selection created units where every soldier shared a commitment to principles that outsiders found extreme or even irrational. The refusal to admit needing rescue became a permanent part of 101st. Airborne culture and identity. Decades later, this attitude remained so fundamental that it appeared in popular media. The Band of Brothers television series concluded its Bastogne episode with on-screen text, noting that while historians credit Patton with rescuing the 101st, no member of the division has ever agreed they needed rescuing. This statement, appearing in a dramatic production, testified to how completely the cultural principle had been absorbed into divisional identity. Even veterans who joined the 101st decades after Bastogne inherited the cultural understanding that paratroopers do not require rescue when surrounded because being surrounded is a normal operating environment for airborne forces. The attitude transcended specific battles or wars to become a permanent part of organizational culture passed from generation to generation of soldiers who wore the screaming eagle. The press coverage of Bastogne created tensions between public perception and how participants understood events. Newspapers celebrated Patton's dramatic dash to rescue surrounded paratroopers, creating a narrative of cavalry arriving in the nick of time to save beleaguered defenders. This made excellent copy and fit established patterns of heroic military stories. The men of the 101st resented this characterization because it portrayed them as victims requiring rescue rather than warriors accomplishing a mission. McAuliffe repeatedly emphasized in press conferences and interviews that his division never asked for help and never felt they needed rescuing. The only urgent request was for medical personnel to treat casualties, which was logistical support rather than combat rescue. To paratroopers, this distinction, which seemed pedantic to public audiences and journalists who naturally viewed surrounded troops as requiring relief, captured everything essential about their identity and the cultural principles that made airborne operations possible. If paratroopers admitted needing rescue when surrounded, it would invalidate the entire concept of airborne warfare, where small units regularly operate behind enemy lines, expecting to be outnumbered and surrounded. The unbridgeable divide. The transformation that Bastogne revealed was not a change in American tactical doctrine or German military capabilities, but the exposure of an unbridgeable cultural divide between military traditions. German forces fought according to Prussian military principles refined over centuries, emphasizing rational calculation, professional competence, and officer responsibility for soldiers' welfare. American paratroopers fought according to a frontier warrior tradition, emphasizing voluntary acceptance of death as a probable outcome, individual courage, and absolute mission commitment. When facing identical tactical circumstances, these traditions produce completely different operational behaviors. German commanders surrounded at Stalingrad had eventually surrendered after an extended siege because continued fighting became militarily pointless. American paratroopers surrounded at Bastogne never considered surrender because tactical circumstances were irrelevant to mission accomplishment. The contrast illuminated profound differences in how cultures understood warfare, military service, and the relationship between soldiers and missions. McAuliffe's nuts reply became one of the most famous military communications in American history, precisely because it captured this cultural principle so perfectly. The single word contained an entire philosophy of military service that separated volunteers who choose dangerous missions from conventional soldiers serving because required. It communicated absolute confidence that American forces would prevail regardless of tactical disadvantages and expressed contempt for enemy threats that assumed American commanders calculated odds like German officers. Most importantly, it demonstrated that paratroopers operated according to different rules than enemies expected. Von Lüttwitz offered surrender terms, assuming rational commanders would recognize a hopeless situation. McAuliffe replied with a word that meant his forces would fight to the last man because surrender was never an option, regardless of circumstances. A legacy, written in culture. The legacy of Bastogne influenced American military culture for subsequent generations. Every paratrooper who earned jump wings after World War II learned the story of McAuliffe's reply and the division's refusal to admit needing rescue. The narrative became a teaching tool for instilling airborne culture in new volunteers. If you want to be a paratrooper, you must internalize principles demonstrated at Bastogne, where surrounded men fought elite German forces to a standstill because the mission required holding the position. No calculation of odds mattered. The mission was everything. This cultural framework made the 101st Airborne Division one of the most effective fighting formations in military history, not through superior equipment or training, but through cultural principles that eliminated defeat as an acceptable outcome. They fought at Bastogne as they had fought everywhere, absolutely committed to mission accomplishment regardless of personal cost. That was why they refused to admit needing rescue. Being rescued implied they were victims. They were warriors accomplishing their mission. The distinction defined everything that made them airborne. They defended that distinction as fiercely as they defended Bastogne, because both represented the same truth. American paratroopers never surrender, never quit, and never need rescuing. They volunteered specifically to fight where conventional soldiers would fail. That remains their purpose, their identity, and their permanent legacy from 8 frozen days in December when they held a crossroads and refused to acknowledge that doing so was impossible. The Germans offered them escape. They replied, "Nuts." Everything that happened after followed from that word. That was the culture of the American paratrooper.